Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here with us today, and thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar, Best Practices for a High Quality Discussant and Chair Process. My name is Natasha Castiello-Gutiérrez, and I'm the Assistant Director of Conference and Events for the Association for the Study of Higher Education, better known as ASHE. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. So first of all, thank you to each of you for serving as a discussant or a chair for the 2023 ASHE conference. I will take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining the conference, I'm joining this virtual session rather, from the traditional homelands of the Miami and Shawnee people, who among other indigenous groups ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. And as we reflect on the land on which we reside and our current relationship to Indigenous communities, please know that there are resources available on the ASHE website for use in this critical reflection, which I will share in the chat. So today's session is being recorded and will be available on ASHE's YouTube channel as a resource for chairs and discussants. So feel free to share widely with those that may be interested. Live closed captions are being utilized by Zoom AI. So to enable the closed captions, you can select the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and you may need to select more if your screen is smaller. The ASHE discussant and chair roles are two critical pieces of support for the conference that serve both authors and attendees during these sessions. So during the webinar, you are encouraged to use the Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists, and there's no need to hold them to the end. You can ask at any time. I'll also be sharing links in the chat to relevant resources such as the presenter guide, which includes information specifically for discussants and chairs, for paper and PVDS sessions, as well as chairs for works in progress. Additionally, we also have the virtual events code of conduct available for your reference. I'll be here behind the scenes if you need any support during the session, so feel free to send me a private message or email alicia@ashe.ws. So I'd like to extend a very important and heartfelt thank you to the program committee co-chairs and the panelists for their efforts in organizing this program and sharing their experiences and recommendations. During the program today, we will have time to hear from each of them. Each of the invited speakers will share their best practices, address some of the questions that came in, and then towards the end, we will also have a reminder on how to access submitted materials on the conference website. So thank you again for being here. I am excited to turn it over to one of our committee co-chairs, Dr. Angela Boatman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for both being here and for introducing yourself in the chat. Again, please do use the chat to share any questions that you have or anything that's coming up for you. We want this to be interactive. We want to tap into the expertise of these panelists. I am here on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Gerardo Blanco. We are the co-chairs for the program committee for this year's ASHE, and we hope to see so many of you in November. Coming up in Minneapolis. And so really, I'm just here to introduce our panelists, and we're going to learn from their expertise. These four folks were all identified from previous ASHE conferences, actually, from comments at the end in the evaluation saying these are excellent discussants and chairs. And so we know this very much to be true, and we invited them to be here to just talk a little bit about their process of serving as a discussant and or a chair, also any obstacles or things they have encountered along the way. And we will be talking about two different roles here. So we know some of you might be here wanting to learn about being a chair, more about being a chair. Others may be more focused on the discussant role. So we do hope to speak to both of those, but they are different roles. And so we would encourage you to just take a look at the chair and discussant guide that ASHE puts out. Alicia, maybe we could put that link also in the chat again, just to remind everyone about it. But we do have a really helpful chair and discussant guide. So step one for all of you would just be to take a careful read of the discussant guide and the chair guide, because it does give some tips. It even offers some scripts that you could use to opening your remarks as a chair, something you could personalize. But if you feel like you're starting from scratch, no need. The ASHE office has already kind of done some helpful planning for that. So I just want to introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll turn it over to them to talk. We've tried to highlight some talking points that we know are things and concerns people are coming into this session with. But again, do please feel free to use the chat to pose any other additional questions. So I want to introduce Sarah Young, who is coming to us from Trinity, Washington in Washington, D.C., Santiago Castiello, who is coming to us from Seton Hall University in New Jersey, Natasha Croom from Clemson University in South Carolina, and then Robert Kelchen from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Tennessee. Again, all identified by their peers as being particularly skillful in the chair and discussant role. So I'm really happy to have all of them with us today. I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Sarah Young first. Sarah is also serving this year as a member of the Conference Accessibility Committee. So thinking and spending a lot of really thoughtful, intentional time thinking about how to help our sessions be more accessible. And so, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you for some remarks about conference accessibility, and then also anything else you want to share as an expert in this area.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm just pulling up some slides that I put together. So welcome everyone. So excited that you are here today. As was just mentioned, I am on the Accessibility Committee, and in my daily work, I am the Director of Disability Support Services at Trinity Washington University. I'm just gonna hide myself from talking so I can see the screen. So I did want to share just a few general accessibility considerations for everyone to keep in mind. First, accessibility and addressing ableism and ableist behaviors go beyond the provision of accommodations or access devices. While those things are important, we are working to promote accessibility in a further perspective here at ASHE, so please do keep that in mind. And related to that, I'd ask you all to consider how our individuality and our unique differences, whether those are disability related or not, impact our experiences and engagement in general, but also at the ASHE conference and in our individual sessions. So now I'm going to share a couple of considerations for chairs, specifically discussants. I will share some for you in just a moment. But for chairs, based on my own experiences and kind of thinking through accessibility, one thing that comes up as very important would be communication. So communication from chairs to the discussant, but also the presenters prior to and then during the session. So chairs, I believe there are some different examples of communication guidance on the ASHE website. Hopefully you've all reached out to your group by this point. I think the recommendation was to reach out early October, but that is done just to kind of check in, make sure everyone's still planning to attend, but also to start working on those details related to order, related to timing. And then once we get closer to the session to discuss, how will we indicate that time is drawing to an end for one presenter and we need to transition to someone else. It's also important to communicate so you can discuss and support any and all presenter and discussant access needs. So whether those would be interpreters, cart, any items or furniture in the room, maybe room layout related to mobility aspects, but also to understand kind of everyone's unique experiences and individual needs that might come up during a session so you can support them in real time. Also, do remind your presenters and your discussant about different ASHE resources. And so, for example, creating accessible presentations is available on the ASHE website. Myself and the other members of the Accessibility Committee put that together along with some other kind of helpful information related to accessibility in general. But do also consider general audience accessibility as well. So when you get to the session, when you get to the room, is the tech functional? Are microphones working? Is the laptop that's going to be there working? The screen, the projector, the seating, how's everything kind of looking? What's going on? Do any changes need to be made? Do you need to reach out to a tech support person? But then Also, it's important to remind your attendees and also your presenters and discussant about a few different items at the beginning and throughout your session sometimes. So speaking clarity, pace, volume, but also using microphone to discuss, the different content that's being provided and presented, and to ask questions and possibly repeating questions if it wasn't audible for a presenter to hear to be able to respond. And very importantly, reminding everyone and practicing that we are operating from empathy and open-mindedness to create a welcoming and kind of accessible feeling and vibe in our session. Okay, discussants, your turn. So discussants, distinct from the chair. And so for discussants, something that's always come up to me and something that I like to keep in mind is that a discussant should also be part of this communication. So engaging with presenters and the chair if there are any questions about the uploaded materials. Tech issues happen, medical situations happen. Sometimes someone might have to, pull out of the conference at the last minute. You need to be aware of that related to your role in reviewing the content and preparing your remarks and your questions. But it's also important to discuss your approach to your discussant role and portion of the session with your group, with the chair and the presenters, to avoid surprises and to prepare everyone, as well as yourself, for what's going to happen. Are you going to kind of split it up based on the presenters? Are you going to share generally, kind of combining all of the session content and then ask individual questions? What is the approach? And then again, for discussants too, speaking clearly, using pacing when giving your feedback and asking questions, using your microphone, and making sure that it's clear who you're addressing when you are asking questions or when you are giving feedback. That's helpful to not only the presenters, but also the audience. And then finally, I would say for everyone in the group, the chair, the discussant, presenters, be mindful of who to contact in real time if something needs attention during the session related to accessibility. This is pulled directly from the ASHE conference website, so it provides information on who to contact for any questions and concerns, but there will be on-site accessibility staff support. So kind of maybe check that out beforehand when we arrive to the conference hotel, just to make sure you know where that is or who to contact in those moments. And that's going to wrap it up for me right now. Thank you so much.
Sarah, we had a question in the question box that I thought maybe you might be able to speak to. It's an excellent question. As a chair, what do you recommend someone do if the presenter has a PowerPoint presentation that's really hard to read, just due to the way it's designed or really small font? Or you can imagine we've all kind of seen PowerPoint presentations that are really hard to read. Do you have any thoughts about that? It's kind of hard in the moment, of course, to address that.
Sure. So there are some tips online on the ASHE website about making your presentation accessible. And as a chair, and when I've been in different sessions, we've all kind of checked in beforehand, sharing that material. So the chair has it, the discussant has it, because sometimes, the content in the paper is a little bit different than the content on the slides. So if, we're able to share that beforehand, before the session begins, and someone notices, oh, okay, this is really difficult to engage with for me, other people might have that experience. I think it would be good for the chair to discuss that, respectfully, calmly, politely with the presenter, and bring that up as, something that they might be able to help them with. We're all stressed. We have a lot to do, but in those moments, we do want to make sure that the content can be accessed by everyone in attendance. So that's kind of how I would approach that.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say one idea could be to ask for a draft of the slides in advance. And I think the draft can be just that, a draft, but it might give you a sense of this issue arising as the chair. And again, knowing you could acknowledge to them, I understand you might change this before the final presentation. Some of us, I mean myself especially, like I'm revising my slides right up until, I present, but I think at the same time, I usually have a draft I could share at some point. So that might be one way. We appreciate the question. I think that's really great question. All right, seeing no other questions exactly, let's, and keep the questions coming, but also let's turn it over to Santiago. Santiago, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your personal experience serving as a chair discussant, and then also, you know, kind of what motivated you to apply, and what does your process look like when you take on these roles?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Santiago Castiello. I'm an assistant professor at Seton Hall University, which resides in the ancestral lands of the Napi people. And in terms of my personal experience, I started attending ASHE in 2016, and it was kind of like my first time going to a conference, an academic conference, and I was just impressed by what it entails to be, you know, part of these types of communities. So the next year, I signed up to be a chair because obviously I thought as a graduate student that was something that I could do. Obviously, I wasn't prepared to discuss any papers. But my personal experience serving as a chair was amazing as a graduate student, especially because it allowed me to expand my network, to get to know some other people who were presenting during the conference. Because you're reaching out to people beforehand, you get to see a little bit of what's the work that they're doing, and also it gave me an opportunity to kind of participate in this whole academic process of being able to facilitate conversations, making sure that discussants were getting the papers, that the participants knew, what to do during the session. And I think that was a great experience for me to understand better how the academic field was structured and working, especially for someone who wasn't completely familiar with that. So my experience as a chair in those first 3 years as a grad student from 2017 to 2019 were really fantastic in that sense, and it gave me also, I think, a little bit of visibility within my mini community in ASHE, which is CIHE, the Council for International Higher Education. So that also has helped me tremendously, being able to be familiar with these folks. And then after I graduated, I started also serving as a discussant. And my experience serving as a discussant has been fantastic because, first of all, you get the privilege of receiving works that are almost ready to be published, but that are kind of still work in progress. And you have the privilege of reviewing those works and being able to provide some pointers, some feedback, some ideas that you might have about that work. When I was a student and when I was presenting at ASHE as a student, I remember that feedback that I got from the discussants, as well as the questions from the audience, were crucial, right, in order to help me polish those ideas and those manuscripts. So when I was able to be on the other side as a discussant, I think I really enjoyed being able to provide a different perspective, something different that I was seeing on those papers, and being able to provide constructive feedback to participants. And also it gave me a lot of very good skills in terms of being able to read through 3 or 4 different papers and how do they connect. Chairs and program committee members put a lot of work into finding which different papers go well together in a session. So as a discussant, finding also, like, now that you have the actual paper, not just the abstract, how are they connected, and trying to engage the audience and the panelists in a kind of like a higher level conversation on what these 3 or 4 papers are telling us about a specific topic. I think that was also something that has helped me a lot in terms of how I analyze literature, and also in my teaching, right? Because it's kind of what we also do as faculty members. So I think my experience so far in that sense has been great, and it's something that I really recommend, especially for grad students, to start getting involved in academic communities like ASHE. I think it's a very safe space to start getting comfortable in those environments. And then,
Santiago, can I ask you a question about your role as a chair when you were a graduate student or beyond? Do you introduce the panelists with a full bio, or how did you approach the introduction to the sessions?
I think it's really important that, first of all, you as a chair make sure that people are in the session on time, a little bit before, 10 to 15 minutes, and that you go over these type of details. in my experience, I think it's sufficient to introduce people with their main affiliation. Like you don't have to give everyone's like full bio and like a narrative bio or a CV. But I think it's really important to introduce people by their preferred pronouns, their preferred names, and their affiliation. But again, that's something that I would encourage as chairs to, before the session, just make sure that you have everyone on the same page. How are we going to do introductions? Who's going to go first? And what do you feel comfortable me, saying about you when I introduce you? Making sure that you give enough time, obviously, to everyone. So you don't want to take a lot of time introducing people. You want the audience to actually listen to what they have to say, not just to be read their vitae. So that's what.
And then one last question about being a chair at the end of the session. Are you the one moderating the questions? How did you approach the Q&A at the end of the session?
Yes, again, I think that's also something that should be discussed between everyone in the panel. But for the most part, I think people will agree that it's the chair's responsibility to keep time. And when it's time for questions, to open the floor for questions from the audience. And by moderate, I guess I don't see I would say like facilitate the Q&A process. I'm not sure if moderate in the sense of like choosing which questions to pose or not. Like it's basically just making sure that attendees get a chance and get an opportunity to pose questions and to keep panelists on time in responding to those questions. The other thing that I think for the most part, people handle the Q&A after all the presentations. But again, if for any reason the panel agrees that we will give everyone 10 minutes or whatever number of minutes to present, and then we'll have 5 or 10 minutes for questions on that specific paper, and then we'll move forward, I think that's okay, as long as everyone agrees and as long as we actually keep the time so that everyone has the exact same time to present and to respond to questions on their specific papers. But I would say that for the most part, the chair moderates those at the end of the session. Just make sure that everyone's comfortable with whatever decision the group makes.
I don't know if you do it this way or our other panelists, but one tip I always had as a chair myself was to come prepared with a question or two, because it can sometimes be this lull in the, when the Q&A starts and you may need to be the one to ask the first question. I've often found that kicks off other questions from the crowd, but it's helpful to come with a question or two. And sometimes I'm coming up with those during the session. I'm not necessarily, coming with them, but it's something I think of during the session.
That's a great point. And I was going to say that the latter part, that I think sometimes as chair, you don't necessarily, have the time or anything to go through all the papers. I don't know if chairs get access. I don't remember if chairs get access to the papers. So I don't know to what extent you can prepare questions beforehand, but for sure, as chair, one of your responsibilities is to be very, attentive to what's happening to the presentations. And I would recommend definitely, taking some notes, having some possible questions. That for sure will be helpful.
Great, thank you so much, Santiago. Let's move to Natasha to talk a little bit more about the discussant role, perhaps, and just kind of how you think about synthesizing across the papers. What is your process as a discussant when you get the papers? Any wisdom you want to share here?
Sure. Good day. My name is Natasha Croom, and my gender pronouns are she, her. As noted, I am at Clemson University, which is, I'm currently occupying ancestral and traditional homelands of the Cherokee. And Clemson University was actually built by enslaved laborers and enslaved peoples, and convict laborers. And I give this history not lightly, and I make these acknowledgments about the land and the peoples, and my commitments to Indigenous communities in particular are around access and graduate education at Clemson as the current Associate Dean for Academic and Student Affairs in our graduate school. Thank you all for inviting me here. The discussant role really is one of my favorite roles at Clemson, excuse me. I haven't had enough coffee, at ASHE. And so when I think about like how I prepare for discussant commentary, I feel like the obvious answer is I read the papers first, right? So I think about my feedback style as pretty conversational. So if I'm reading your paper, you might see a like HUH question mark in there. Like I'm really trying to interact with your writing and the ideas that you're that you're putting forward as the author and scholar, and ensuring that, and I try to make sure that I have written feedback for everyone. And like most of us, there's a lot on our plate. So if I'm not able to give as in-depth line by line each page feedback, I definitely ensure that you get a synthesis of my feedback. Like, what are some of the areas that I really love? What are some of the areas that I have questions about, and synthesize each paper in that way. So if you don't get the actual, you'll know if you're getting an actual paper back from me, because I come with a folder and I will hand you back your paper, like physically hand it to you at ASHE. It gives me something to do. It makes me feel special. No, I'm kidding. But right. Or you'll get that synthesized feedback. And then I think there's this question about, in the session as a discussant, how much maybe time, how do you balance giving individual paper feedback versus bringing everything together? And so what I try to do is to consider what the thread of the session is. So what's supposed to be holding these papers together, and not to give any trade secrets away, Angela, but as a person who's been on the program committee a number of times, sometimes, that thread is a little bit thicker and sometimes it's a little bit thinner. So, trying to really think about what that thread is that's supposed to be holding these papers down. And I will often jot down a few notes about what I think really ties those papers together. And sometimes, but not all the time, this might include me providing like a summary of what's currently in the literature or what's not in the literature. And I think how that helps, I think it's a useful tactic, especially if you're going to talk about how someone's work is extending or critiquing, for example, the current body of literature. So it's helpful to have on hand a couple of sentences about, kind of, here's how I understand the direction of that body of literature, and here's how this person's work is doing an amazing job at extending it, or here's how this critique that they're providing is really useful. I've definitely seen folks who write out their entire feedback. So they literally have like a script that they kind of read from, and they're probably comfortable with that. And I've seen that be really helpful to discussants who do that, to kind of stay on track with the content and the time. I'm more of a points person, so I'll type out or write out really a couple of points, and I'm a guesstimate time person. So I'm always really thankful for helpful chairs who can keep me to the 10 to 15 minutes. And, I don't, I listen to the people. And then there was sort of this question about how I use the time in the session in the way that I think is most beneficial. So my understanding is that really the purpose of this format of session, and I think this is what Santiago is also saying, is to get pointed feedback from your colleagues and to be able to engage with the audience on your ideas that you presented in this space. So I approach my feedback in that way. And if you hear nothing else that I say, in my mind, it's not about me. That's how I approach it. It's not about me. Like, I think that we operate in a space as higher education that would say, oh, the discussant is this key expert person that knows, a lot about this topic. And while that could very well be the case, like, just remaining centered in the collectivity of the space, in that as the discussant, I'm bringing something to this space, but there's so many other people around that are also bringing things to the space as well. So it's not about me as the discussant showing how much I know. It's about their work and helping to facilitate that dialogue with and between scholars. And sort of alongside of what Santiago, and I think the question maybe, Angela, you asked about facilitating the Q&A. I do think it's so important for the chairs not only to check in with the presenters, but to check in with the discussant, so that everybody, as he said, is on the same page about what is about to happen. Because I actually prefer to facilitate the Q&A, so there's not a lot of transitioning time between me giving my comments and then the Q&A starting. But I certainly will yield if the chair is like, I'm really prepared to facilitate these Q&A. And I think kind of to Santiago's point about, you know, the chairs may not have read the paper, so that idea of having some predetermined questions might be a little bit harder to come by. But I have read the papers, right? So if I see that there's a little bit of a lull and I've given the 13 seconds of quiet for people to jump in, then I can ask some prompt, you know, give some prompts or whatever. But overall, I would say, you know, these are our colleagues. And so as you're thinking about the kind of feedback that you want to give them in this public forum, to keep that in mind, that they are our colleagues, and that the point of this is to be helpful and not harmful. And that it's not about us as the discussant, but it's about the collective knowing and thinking that can happen and the synergy that can happen in the space. And then thirdly, I would say really to make sure that you're touching base with the chair before the session, so that everyone is on the same page. And really quickly, I'll wrap because I feel like this is a question that gets asked often. What happens if I don't get a paper? Like, what happens if someone just really showed up and they just ignored the, hey, do you have a paper? This has actually happened to me before at ASHE. And typically what I will do is I will pull that scholar aside before the session starts and let them know, like, I didn't receive your paper and I know you're probably prepared to do a presentation. And I'll give them a choice. Like, I'm happy to give some feedback on the spot, knowing that it will literally be feedback to what I'm watching and saying. And then sort of fitting that into, the broader comments on it. And then, I just keep my own boundary. Like the time to get my feedback was before. And so therefore I probably, if you're asking me to give feedback on your paper after ASHE, the answer is likely going to be no, because you had an opportunity for that. But I think, again, the important thing, these are our colleagues, things happen. So, no calling out needed. Like, no one should ever know in the session that you didn't send your paper, at least not because I told them you didn't send your paper.
Thank you, Natasha. So if I, just to sort of recap a little bit about what you said, you give more detailed feedback, maybe personally to the authors, either in handwritten notes on their paper or maybe a summary. And then when it comes to the session, you balance the time between making links across the presentations, as well as do you take any time to individually talk about each paper as well, even if it's not super detailed as a discussant?
Yes. Oh, thank you for that clarifying question. So I actually spend more time giving individual time to each paper than in doing sort of this like linking synergy synthesis. Again, as I read through each of the papers, and again, depending on sort of how thick and tight that thread is, it will determine whether I will spend a little bit more time doing that, what's holding these papers together kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So yeah,
yes.
it's less prescriptive and more so, I think, based on what I'm seeing and what I'm reading, because I feel like we've all been to ASHE sessions where you've got two papers that they were really perfect together, and the third paper just had the same word in it as something else, but that didn't have anything to actually do with what the other folks were talking about. So, I try to balance, am I going to do a lot more of that synthesis? And does someone get left out, or does it require me to make something up? So most of the time I'm giving more direct feedback for each paper and each set of scholars. But I will have that threading piece, and then I'm able to pull on that if I think that it's useful in this space.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And now let's turn it to Robert, our last panelist here. Robert, I know you've served in both of these roles, so any wisdom you have there, but maybe to get us started, I know there were several questions about either mostly as a chair, but sometimes this comes up as a discussant as well. What are ways to ensure that everyone gets a chance to speak? How do you keep the time? Essentially what this is asking is, how do we interrupt or signal to someone that that they are now going overtime.
Yeah, as a chair, this is a difficult thing because you get very important senior person who did not prepare well and would like to go double their time. And as a grad student or early career person, that feels really intimidating. So I would recommend two different things. One is asking for help from some other people who have done this before, asking help from some other senior people if you need it. Another thing is the way a lot of people keep track of time is using their phone, setting an alarm. And if an alarm goes off, that creates some kind of social pressure. They may ignore all your other cues, but that at least helps give people the wrap it up sign. It doesn't always work, but hopefully at least it helps people rush a little bit more toward the conclusion.
Yeah. Thank you for that. What do you think? Another question for you. How do you offer suggestions on papers where it's not really your area of expertise? Maybe the methodology isn't quite your expert area. Maybe the topic isn't one you know much about, but you know a lot about the methodology. As a discussant, how do you think about that?
As a discussant, I think I operate differently than a lot of people. I give a lot of feedback privately, and I'll treat it like a journal article review at that point. I'll focus on the areas where I feel a lot more comfortable talking about, whether it's the content or the methods. It may not be both. And putting on the journal reviewer hat, it's okay to accept something if you don't know the methods. Focus on the content. So that part's okay. And then the other part of the question, I got going a little bit.
And I think that's just either offering feedback when you don't feel like you're an expert. So you're sort of saying there's certainly parts of this you can comment on, and you kind of tend to focus more on those parts.
And then as a discussant, I'm asking big picture questions of the group rather than focusing on the individual details of each paper. That I'm asking, what does this all mean for the field? What's the so what of the various topics? Not necessarily getting deeper in the weeds publicly. I'll do that privately. And I think that also both limits the amount of time I'm talking, giving more time to either the presenters or the audience, and really helps spark a good conversation.
And we asked this of Natasha as well, but what is your process when you get the papers for discussing them?
My process is I read them and treat them like a journal article. I provide a lot of feedback privately. Ideally, I get it to people a couple days before the conference, so they have a sense of where I may be coming from. But I also frame it around, these are not the questions I'll be asking you publicly. Publicly, I'm talking more about what are the big takeaways? What's the so what? How do we take advantage of having 20, 30, 40 really smart people in the room to think about where the field is going in these areas? And maybe not about this study, but what can they do for the next study on this topic as well?
Excellent. I thought maybe we would just certainly can go to some questions from the group. If there are any, please ask them here. But I thought we might end with from all four of you, any sort of tips on what you think a successful chair and discussant is, either from your own perspective, but just having also attended lots of ASHE sessions. Does anything come to mind when you think of like, oh, that was an excellent chair? Like, what was it that person did? Or that was an excellent discussant. Those comments were so helpful. Is there anything that comes to mind that you've observed and or done yourself that you think is particularly helpful for this crowd? And open it up to anyone.
There was a question in the chat, and I do think the ultimate point is what is helpful, and that is just that communication is key, right? Like the more you can communicate with folks, I think the better experience it is overall. And so I remember now it feels like a really long time ago being a chair and saying, being able to communicate with the discussant and the presenters, and just, using that role to sort of get everyone on the same page, I think can make for a smoother session in general. And then as a discussant, again, like communicating expectations, boundaries, what do you need? I think the question was, I might have misspoke earlier, but the question about receiving the paper after the deadline. So once the deadline passes and I haven't gotten any papers, I actually always email the authors and say, I'm happy to get the paper before the deadline. I just need it before I get on the airplane. You know what I mean? And so just being able to be open and communicate with folks, because again, like, you know, people are living their lives and doing their work, and then they're doing ASHE also. So just really, I think that communication piece is important.
Thank you. So it's a good reminder to everyone here, if you are chairing a session at this year's ASHE, email the panelists, you know, like if you haven't already, many of you probably already have, but send an email, bring the group together, put them all on the same thread so that there's the ability to apply, put the discussant on that thread. If you are a discussant and you don't need the papers by the deadline and you're fine, as Natasha said, getting them the week before the conference or even a few days before, you can tell the panelists what you need, and they will be happy to often to share those with you. So communication, it also makes the session just feel as if you all know each other. You know, you're not sort of communicating for the first time that day. You've already had some email correspondence. Thank you. That's great, Natasha. Other comments? Yeah, Santiago.
Yeah, I'll just add, the way I see it, you know, a successful chair of discussing with someone, and I think very in line with what Natasha said earlier, someone who understands that, you know, you're among colleagues and that you're doing service to those colleagues and to the field. So someone who is, you know, caring and understands and puts themselves on the shoes of the presenters. So if you're a chair, knowing that the way, or by providing this order and structure to the session, will probably, you know, ease a little bit of the tension and the nerves of whoever's presenting, because now you have laid out what's going to happen in the session. And as a discussant, putting yourself on the other person's shoes and understanding that the feedback that you provide is something that, you know, people will value and use to improve their scholarship. So that you approach that feedback just like you would approach, you know, providing feedback as a peer reviewer or as a teacher, as an instructor. So being like that caring individual that understands that you're doing service to your colleagues, I think that makes you a very successful new role.
And I would say, as a chair, success is successfully herding cats. Just getting everyone to respond, get things in, and then help seeding some potential questions. As a discussant, my goals are really twofold. First is for people with papers, trying to help them save a round of review in the peer review process. And I'll even ask people, what's your goal for this? Do you have a journal in mind? Is it already out under review, or is it much earlier in the process? And then also helping to foster connections among those who are attending. This is one of those rare opportunities we get a bunch of us together to discuss fascinating stuff. And I like to see partnerships come out of this.
I would also say for me, for the chair, it's very nice when the chair is kind of tapped in during the session and really engaged. I've been in some sessions where the chair is not those things. And so it leads to a bit of a chaotic situation with the timing. But when the chair is tapped in and when they're aware, when those tense moments come up sometimes in the Q&A portion, or, you know, different portions of the session, they can sometimes swoop in and say, okay, you know, bringing in humor or bringing in something that moves us along. The chair needs to be tapped in, needs to be following along, engaged, needs to be ready to go as kind of the project manager of the group.
Yeah, I think that is so helpful and important. Santiago, also when you spoke to, it actually is, it provides a level of comfort for everyone in the session when things are well organized. You know what you're planning for. So even though it can feel sometimes difficult to be the one in charge of the timer, you are providing a great service and sort of peace of mind for the rest of the session, because nobody wants to be, you know, you don't want to shortchange that last panelist because now we've run out of time. You want to think of this as some equity across all of the panelists. We did have a question in the chat that was about what types of questions encourage further conversation. And I think, you know, I'd be interested if there are other thoughts on this, but I sort of thought of this when Natasha was talking about sort of broader, more linking questions. Sometimes what really can get a conversation going are questions about that might apply to more than one panelist, right? So that might encourage a little bit more conversation than just a pointed question about a particular paper. If you were thinking as a chair in trying to kind of get some conversation going, questions that might be more a little bit broader in their nature, that might have something to do with implications or policy links, current, you know, links to current issues. These are things that more than one panelist can usually speak to, and that I think that can be helpful in hearing from more than one voice. It's always nice. I think we've all been in sessions where a question gets asked that really starts a dialogue. Like you start to get even someone from the audience says, I work at this organization and we've been facing this issue in our organization. And that's always a really nice moment. And so if you can, I think a bit broader, that can sometimes help to facilitate that. Any other comments about that, ways to kind of get the room talking? That's always a nice moment in a session when you kind of get some back and forth and you get to sit back for a minute.
And I would
all right. Yeah, please.
Like flipping what you said, Angela, right? So like you could ask the question or you could do the thing, right? So as the chair, as what I heard from here, here's how I could use this. Here's what, you know, here's how your implications were resonating with me, right? And then you could look at the audience and say, is anyone, you know, anyone else? So like doing what you said, but also then modeling. But I think that requires, I think what Sarah said was for people, the chair to really be tapped into the conversation and the discussion, the presentations and what's happening in the space. But I think that role modeling could be really helpful right there too.
And just asking broadly about future research, both the panelists in this area and also the audience, I think is a good way to draw people in because people love talking about research ideas.
Excellent. And there's always something you want to do but weren't able to do by the time of ASHE or even with that individual paper. So you're right, that often gets people really thinking next steps. At this point, we're going to turn it back over to Alicia to sort of give us the how-to of all of this. But thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for joining today.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to go over a couple of logistical kind of housekeeping pieces. So let me get my slides up. I know that we've gone over some of this in the chat with folks, but I also want to make sure you all know where to find some really great information because there's a lot of rich resources available on the website, but we know how websites are and they're very hard to navigate sometimes with such dense information. So let me share this here. Okay, so we will be sharing this in the chat, this link here. It's I'll reshare it again so you can follow along during the session and get your questions answered if anything comes up. But basically, you can use this tiny URL to access the conference portal. And I know we were talking about deadlines and when you all need to be communicating with folks. So just a reminder, the deadline for the virtual conference day submissions were on October 19th. So those of you who are discussants and chairs for the virtual conference should already have materials ready for you to review. Those of you who are doing the in-person conference, the deadline is October 31st. So if you go in there today, you might not see any materials, any final materials yet. As was mentioned by Dr. Croom, it is totally up to you whether or not you want to review and provide feedback for late submissions. Presenters have been told that if they miss the deadline, discussants will, may elect to provide cursory feedback or no feedback at all. So that has been communicated. As a note, until the submitter uploads their final materials, the files in the system defaults to supplemental information that was submitted with their proposal, if any. So some of you might log in today if you're doing the in-person conference and see just an attachment of a chart or some resources that were supplemental to the paper or the session materials. So that is normal, and you will see the final once it's available at the deadline. Discussants of PVDS sessions will receive an email from the ASHE staff with their session information. So those materials look a little bit different sometimes. So if you haven't received that, you will soon. And if you have any questions about PVDS session materials, you can reach out to us. So in the chat, you can see the link for this tiny URL, but it's pretty short. You can type it in as well. From the website, you're going to scroll down here to log in to the system. And then you should be able to see chair a discussant there when you log in with your profile. From there, there's a couple of tabs. So you just want to make sure you're on the participations tab, and then you'll be able to see any sessions that you've been assigned to view as a created session. That's the status, it'll be there. And you can click on view for that. From here, you'll be able to download the submission files. And at this point, again, those of you doing the in-person might not have the full file yet. If you are missing things or if you have questions about it, the emails are also here for the folks that are in your session. I know that was a question posted in the chat. So all of this information is here for you, and we can stick around towards the end to answer specific questions, but you can also email me at alicia@ashe.ws or conference@ashe.ws if you are having some really specific challenges that you need help with. We know how technology can be sometimes, but this is where you're going to be able to view all the materials for the sessions. Okay. Dr. Boatman, I will pass it back to you if there's additional Q&A. I think we have just a few minutes left.
We did, Alicia, have one question that would be helpful if you know. I don't know if you do, but are the presentations loaded onto the room computers? Is there a computer available in the room, and does it have presentations already on it, or should the chairs request that those presentations be sent and or they bring them that day?
Yes, great question. So ASHE will provide in-room laptops. So there will be laptops in the rooms, so they don't have to worry about, switching those out. But we do encourage folks, they need to bring their presentation. So we encourage you to email it to yourself, bring it on a drive of some kind, because it won't be preloaded into the system. The presenters are in charge of doing that. Good question.
Very helpful. Well, thank you, everyone. It doesn't look like there are any more questions, but there are lots of resources available on the ASHE website. So we would encourage you to, again, read the chair and discussant guide. Lots of your questions can probably be found there. I have found that myself. I often have a question and then see, oh, they've already written an introductory script for me for this session. So a lot of the work has been taken care of for you, and then just be in touch with your panel. But I, again, want to thank all of you for joining. Please reach out to the ASHE office if you have other questions. So excited to see so many of you in Minneapolis. Thank you again to our panelists for taking time out this busy time of year. And we'll see you all in Minneapolis, hopefully. And if not, take care. Take care, everyone. Have a good week.